Hello guys, and welcome back to another video. Now that we have finished the set review completely, I'm gonna start recording limited and constructed videos. So today I'm gonna do a deck tech on one of the top decks, Rakano Aggro. First of all, let me introduce myself briefly. I've basically played strategy card games for more than half my life. I started playing Magic in 1998 when I was, let me think, 12 or 13 I think, and basically started playing competitively in the early 2000s, so I basically also play these games competitive for half my life, and I had some decent success in Magic. I played a bunch of Pro Tours. I have a Pro Tour top 16 finish, and I also have a Grand Prix top 8 where I lost in the finals, so I have quite some success to show for. Also a couple of minor money finishes that are not that worth mentioning, and some credibility and a lot of experience that I bring with me, and that make me, I would say, fairly competent in these games. And Eternal is very similar to Magic in the sense that most of the strategic concepts and basic ideas apply here, with some slight modifications due to the subtle differences in the game, which I will get to later. When they come up, I will mention how they differ, especially for my Magic viewers. So before I dive into the deck tech real quick, let me show you I'm currently Masters League top 20, 17th. So also to show you that in this game I'm playing at the highest level basically, and playing very competitively, and also succeed at doing so. So I'm not all talk, no results, for anyone that cares. So now that we got some proof of my credibility out of the way, let's dive right into the deck tech. So this is my current list. Let's do it like this. So Rakano Aggro is one of the premier aggro decks in the game right now. It's basically a Justice and Fire Warcry weapon-based aggro deck that plays all the most efficient units, the few of the best weapons, some efficient cheap combo tricks and or removal to gain tempo, and yeah, pretty basic concept. Let's go over the card choices real quick. First we have Finest Hour. Finest Hour is, in Magic you would call it Giant Growth, just an efficient combat trick. Pretty nice synergy with Pyroknight, which often runs into cheap throwaway units like Temple Scribe, which is a 2-power 1/1 that draws the opponent a card, so they would trade efficiently there and only take 1 damage, and Pyroknight would die. But casting Finest Hour on the Pyroknight there is great, because you still get to deal 4 damage to the opponent, and your Pyroknight lives to later potentially be ultimated or enhanced by a weapon or something. So that's some nice synergy. The 2 1-drops are like the best 1-drops in the color combination. Oni Ronin is a bit more vulnerable and worse late game than Pyroknight, but he is the best actual 1-drop on turn 1, because starting to Warcry from turn 2 onwards is just really powerful, and even if it trades with, say, the mentioned Temple Scribe, you still basically get at least 1/1 of his 2/1 stats back on top of your deck on the next unit or weapon you draw. So also there the trade is not as bad as it seems. There's not many other good 1-drop options for this deck. I tried the Empower Infantry a bit, but the deck just doesn't run that many power cards, and also doesn't have that much synergy. Is really nice on turn 1 basically, and after turn 1 it gets real bad real quick. Also the mana is built in a way, like the influence is built in a way that you reliably have turn 1 fire influence, so a green 1-drop is definitely worse there. One card that I could see trying and want to try, didn't get around to yet, is Tinker Apprentice, because it, unlike Oni Ronin, it gives you the effect only one time, but it gives it to a card in your hand, so you can, for example, make your 2/2 Warcry dudes into 3/3s, which is really powerful actually, and especially really great in the mirror where your opponent plays his 2/2 and you play a 3/3, or can do things like turn your Sword of Icaria into a 4/3 to kill the opposing 2/2 in the mirror and still are left with a 4/1 weapon that you can protect and stuff like that. There's a lot of really nice things it can do while still trading with the opposing Pyroknights, Oni Ronins in the mirror or other matchups. And it's another body to later enhance with a weapon or something. So that's definitely a card to keep in mind and try out. I don't run any Inspire. I think the card just doesn't really belong in the deck. It's too dirtly. I really want to curve out. I want to go 1-drop into 2-drop into Sword of Icaria or Valkyrie basically, or a 2-drop plus Finest Hour or Torch usually. And if I have Inspire there, I don't want to cast Inspire because I want to hold Finest Hour up to protect myself against opposing combat tricks or Torch, or simply have Torch in order to blow out the opponent if they use a combat trick and stuff like that. So yeah, you usually often cannot efficiently cast Inspire until later, which also makes it worse in fixing your land drops. And yeah, the deck just optimally curves out 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's just no power left to cast Inspire. I think the card just is a bit of a misfit, and I rather have an influence, a power card or two more in my deck than having to try to find them with a card that costs me power. It's like a bit better Seek Power, and you wouldn't put Seek Power in a deck like that. I think it's just a mistake in my opinion to run that card. Yeah, next we have Torch. Not much to explain here. Super efficient removal that can also kill the opponent if they are almost dead. Just a great card. Next we have the 12 2-drops. Champion of Glory is not always that great on turn 2. There's one thing that's worth noting here. Depending on what matchup you're up against, if you play this guy on turn 2 and you can't play it as a 3/3, it's pretty important to decide whether you play it as a 3/1 or a 1/3. Like against black decks, you definitely, like against shadow decks, you definitely want to play it as a 1/3 because of Vara's favor, among others, and there's not really much they can do to punish you for playing it as a 1/3. While against the mirror, playing it as a 1/3 is terrible if you are on the draw, because then your opponent will play his Sword of Icaria on turn 3 and kill your Champion of Glory for free, leaving him with a 3/1 weapon to also kill your turn 3 play, and then you're about to basically have lost the game, because yeah, that's just such a tempo swing and value swing if Sword of Icaria gets to kill your 2 and 3 drop, that you're not gonna recover from it. So it's very important to only play it as a 3/1 in the Rakano mirror, or against other matchups where similar concepts apply. Next off we have the 2 Warcry guys. They have different upsides basically. So if I have both and like a 3rd power and say a Finest Hour, I tendentially play Crownwatch on 2, so the opponent can't tempo me by killing it, especially if they have no blocker in play yet. And the Outlaw on turn 3, at least against red decks. So if they try to suffocate or torch it, I can counter that with a Finest Hour. And Finest Hour also counters Suffocate. So against decks with Suffocate or Torch, this is often the better sequencing. The only reason to play Outlaw over Paladin on turn 2 in that scenario is if the opponent already has a blocker that can't block Outlaw but would block or trade with Paladin. And also depending on how your hand lines up, like for example if I have a Hammer of Might in hand, I'm fine with potentially playing this on 2, because I don't really want to block or trade with this anyway, and rather just play it on 3 to reliably equip it with a hammer on 4. So yeah, then the Outlaw on turn 2 is better, even at the risk of getting it killed by removal for tempo. Next off we have Vanquish, basically the problem solver of the deck. If there's anything that's like racing you or too big to attack into, Vanquish to the rescue. The point simply is the card is situational, and the opponent might not always have a threat that you can kill with it, that you have a Vanquish in hand, so that's why there's only 3, because if you ever draw 2 Vanquish without targets, or draw 2 Vanquish and the opponent has only 1 target, you're in kind of a bad spot. So you want 1 as often as possible, but you want 2 as rare as possible, so that's kind of a typical 3-off. A bit less so in this game, because your deck is 15 cards bigger than in Magic, but in Magic, normally, if you want a card as often, like all the time, and as many copies as you can, then you play 4. If it's a card that's good, but a bit situational, and you want to avoid drawing multiple copies, then you run 3, so you have it often, but reduce the chance to have multiple copies by as much as possible without crippling your chance of having it at all too much, if that makes sense. Also keep in mind, at worst you can like Finest Hour Vanquish an opposing unit. Like for example, if Finest Hour wouldn't help you kill it without trading in combat, you might as well just Finest Hour the blocker and Vanquish it in order to kill the opponent, if the damage would then be lethal. Like, obviously if Finest Hour doesn't kill the unit in combat without trading, then it's probably vanquishable anyway. But there can be units that have like low attack but high health that might otherwise like blank your guy, and Finest Hour doesn't deal enough damage to kill the unit in combat. Like for example a Cavalry healer that has 2 enhancements on him and is like 2/8, then a lot of your units would not kill it with Finest Hour in combat, but then you can just like Finest Hour the Cavalry healer and vanquish it. Or in another scenario, if your attack would be lethal if the blocker wasn't there, then instead of killing the blocker with Finest Hour in combat, you just Finest Hour vanquish the blocker and kill the opponent. I just had that happen to me yesterday or so, where Finest Hour vanquish on the opponent blocker that keeps him from dying wins me the game right away, rather than only puts me ahead if I attack and Finest Hour there, and then the opponent has a chance to recover. Next we have Sword of Icaria. This card is kind of a catch-all. It's like not super powerful, super amazing. It can sometimes be really impressive if it gathered a lot of Warcry triggers on top of the deck, and then actually gains you a bunch of life and a nice board control tool. Other than that, it often is a nice answer to Crownwatch Paladin in the mirror, and just in general an okay removal that can sometimes 2-for-1 the opponent. Like you can kill an Initiate of the Sands or a Temple Scribe or stuff like that, or Talia's Fairward, and then still have a weapon left that you can protect with blockers and kill something more meaningful the next turn and stuff like that. And yeah, there's the things that I mentioned with Champion of Glory and stuff. And the mentioned Tinker Apprentice as an option certainly makes this card a bit more impactful and versatile if you want to try him. Next we have Valkyrie Enforcer, just premium 3-drop. Flying is always great for an aggressive deck, evasion to fly over opposing units. The silence helps you either cripple the opponent or deal with problematic units, like you can for example silence an Initiate of the Sands to set back the opponent on power. You can silence a Titan that you have no removal for, so the Valkyrie Enforcer can fly over the Titan and the Titan cannot freely race, because oftentimes without the endurance they cannot afford to attack with their Titan, because then they risk losing the race. So it kind of shuts down the Titan attacks and stuff like that. And in the mirror it's really powerful to just silence a Champion of Glory and cripple it into a 1/1 with no abilities. also keep in mind it also silences the effects of all attachments of the unit. Like if someone is equipped with a Deepforged blade, if you silence them, they also lose Overwhelm and Endurance, which is pretty nice. So yeah, all in all, just a really good card. Next we have an interesting card that I'm currently trying that other people don't play. Most people currently have something like more 5-drops or Righteous Fury in that spot. I played Righteous Fury for a while. I felt the card is just kind of a win more, clunky and situational. If you don't have a quick draw unit, it often is not as good unless you have like a big monster anyway, and then oftentimes you cast it on that big monster and the big monster gets killed by a Vanquish or Annihilate or Death Strike or something, and it's a huge blowout. And if you have a big guy that needs to be jump blocked every turn, you should probably be winning anyway, so you don't need the Righteous Fury. And it's bad on small units, and it's bad if you have no units, and it also doesn't help your unit not die in combat usually, unless they have quick draw. So yeah, all in all, Righteous Fury was pretty unimpressive in my opinion. And this card actually seems pretty nice, because first of all, it's something that kind of a similar effect to a weapon, except that it's also a unit. So if you have no unit at all, you can play this as a unit in order to set up a turn 5 blade, for example, or a turn 5 hammer if you're out of units. And I think that happens more often than you'd like with this deck, that you simply have a bunch of things to enhance units and removal, like Vanquish, Finest Hour, Sword of Icaria, Hammer of Might in hand, but no unit to put that stuff on. So having a card that's both kind of a weapon and a unit is pretty great. And while the card in its unenhanced state is a bit weak, it's not terrible, like 4/4, 4/4 effectively, and half the stats having charge and making your best unit better, therefore most likely outclassing anything on the board, is better than 4 power 4/4 would be already. And the unique thing about this card is basically that, unlike other cards, effectively every Warcry gives this card +2/+2 rather than +1/+1, because every Warcry trigger makes the unit grow by +1/+1, but also makes the summon trigger grow by +1/+1. So with one Warcry trigger, this is basically 6/6/4/4 instead of a 5/5/4/4 that you would normally have. So with one Warcry trigger, this is already like basically a better Hammer of Might, because you get a 3/3 and +3/+3 on your unit, while a Hammer of Might with one Warcry trigger gives +4/+4 and +3/+3 on the next thing you draw, which first of all might not be drawn on the next turn. Second of all, then has to be spent power on to cast, and even then it's already 1 turn slower than the Cavalry, which is already in play and can attack. And once you get the second trigger, this is basically a better hammer, like way better than hammer, and having a 4/4 that gives +4/+4 to another unit in play is incredibly powerful and a huge tempo swing. I just started testing this, so I'm not 100% sure how well it plays out in practice, but the theory is very sound, and I just wanted some more cards that do what Hammer does, because turn 4 Hammer is just the key to the deck. If you curve out into turn 4 Hammer, that gives you so much tempo and so much pressure, and it's such a huge swing that often wins you the game. And having more of that effect to more reliably go turn 4, push ahead play that is like Hammer is really great. And yeah, that's why I want this guy. If that guy for some reason does not pan out, I'd probably incline to try some Tinker Apprentices like I mentioned, or similar stuff. Yeah, next we have Hammer. I basically already said everything about Hammer. This is like the key card in the deck, one of the things that makes the deck so powerful. just jam it on a quick draw unit or against removal decks on a Crownwatch Paladin and watch them suffer. It's just really powerful, and it also snowballs pretty hard thanks to its summon trigger, basically giving you +3/+3 to your next to your 2 units, your current one and the next one you draw, or making a weapon like Sword of Icaria into a legitimate board control tool. And last but not least, we have Deepforged Blade. The options here basically are Deepforged Blade and Soulfire Drake. I personally am not very impressed with Soulfire Drake. First of all, 2 health is very low, basically makes it trade with any flyer. Like if your opponent has a Valkyrie Enforcer, Soulfire Drake is pretty embarrassed unless it has 2 or more Warcry triggers. There's cards like Wasp that block it while generating tempo and not taking any damage because there's no overwhelm. So the Wasp just eats it for 2 power cheaper. Torch is a gigantic tempo swing there. Similar things go for cards like Annihilate. And if the Drake is not enhanced or only like enhanced once by Warcry and the opponent has an Obelisk and a Titan, Drake is super embarrassed. Stuff like that, and the list goes on and on. Also, if you're too far behind or like under defense, Drake is super embarrassing because you can't even use the charge to attack, and it makes for a fairly bad blocker too. And Deepforged Blade basically doesn't have any of those problems. Like, the overwhelm usually makes it so that your biggest attacker does not get jump blocked anymore every turn, which I felt is a reasonably big issue with this deck. There's a lot of jump blocking, and that can sometimes get troublesome in races, especially if your biggest guy is not a Champion of Glory with endurance. So having overwhelm there actually makes you convert the huge guy that you have in play into actual damage. Also, if the opponent wasps your gigantic Deepforged Blade guy, whatever, at least they take 1,000,000 damage. Also, if you already have like a big endurance guy like Champion of Glory, you can put this on a second guy to have two huge endurance attackers that overwhelm over like one of them overwhelms over small blockers, and the opponent probably won't have good blocks and has to like jump block and lose the game. Also, Deepforged Blade destroys Permafrost, which is also pretty relevant because one of the top 3 decks right now is Shimmer Pack, which runs 4 Permafrost, and there's also other decks that run Permafrost like Fan Control or Haunting Scream, for example, or Icaria Blue. So all in all, having your curved topping I win the game card also retrospectively kill an opposing removal is great. Yeah, there's some potential blowout occasionally if you have no Crownwatch Paladin to put it on. Against decks that run Annihilate, you can still put it on Champion of Glory, so they can't annihilate it, so they at least need like a Death Strike or something, because Permafrost and Annihilate don't work anymore. And yeah, I just feel like the overwhelm and endurance and extra health that this gives compared to Drake are exactly what this needs. Drake is basically only good or better against control decks where plate is not that great, and also the charge and the card extra being a body and not needing a unit in play to do something, and also the trigger mattering is nice, because the trigger from like the Entomb trigger from Soulfire Drake a lot of the times outside of like drawn out matches against control doesn't matter that much, because against like mid-rangey unit decks they either kill you before it matters, or they already have the board gummed up so much that the charge doesn't do anything, and the flying might also be too slow before they start turning their board sideways to just kill you anyway. So the Entomb trigger of Soulfire Drake is often irrelevant, and also Soulfire Drake is very embarrassed by opposing marshals and Valkyrie enforcers that silence it, turning it into a 5/2 that doesn't do anything, while Blade still gives +X, like in the unenhanced +5/5, while the Endurance and Overwhelm are gone. You still have a gigantic monster that can probably attack into anything the opponent has. So yeah, I don't see any reason to Blade Drake over Blade, unless you're facing like mostly control decks, which is not gonna happen. Also, the other thing is there's decks like Burn that have Impending Doom and their own Drakes, and Umbrant Reapers, where Blade usually makes them jump block or not able to block, and if you like play Soulfire Drake there, they're just gonna like trade and not take any damage, which is pretty good for them if they're just trying to like stabilize and burn you out. And Blade just lets you keep pushing, which is exactly what the deck wants, and Overwhelm is definitely something this deck needs in my opinion. So yeah, very clear Deepforged Blade over Drake, or at least a mix if you run more than 2. Like if I would run a third 5-drop, I could see maybe playing 1 Drake to mix it up a bit, and also make the deck a bit more balanced against control maybe. Although I feel like I'm not very afraid of my control matchups. Like Armory is probably one of the more worse control matchups, but decks like Fan Control feel like a pretty good matchup to me. Last but not least, we have to talk about power. First of all, I see so many lists running 25 power in this deck. That is incredibly terrible in my opinion. Like, in Magic, a deck like this, in 60 cards, would run 23, maybe 24 lands. Like, if you run 3 or 4 5-drops, this would definitely, in most cases, be a 24 land deck. There have been similar decks in Magic that had 3 or 4 5-drops as their curve topper aggressive decks that have had usually run 24 lands. Like there was a red-black zombie deck that ran 3 Thundermaw Hellkite, sometimes 4, and a bunch of 4-drops as a curve topper. So they were running 24 lands and 3 to 4 5-drops, because you don't put these 4 and 5-drops in your deck to only cast them when you're flooded. You want to play them like every time. Like Hammer of Might is so important that every time I have Hammer in my hand and don't play my Force Power on turn 4 and am able to play Hammer, I want to throw up, and it like makes it so much more likely that I lose the game, or in closer, more like fought over games, basically lose right away, because if I play Hammer there, I'm ahead. If I don't play Hammer there, I fall behind and lose, because this deck plays pretty poorly from behind for obvious reasons, because all the things you have make you having to attack. Like playing Hammer and not attacking is terrible, and if you don't have a Champion of Glory, attacking means you can't block. So yeah, the deck always wants 3 power by turn 3, most of the time 4 power by turn 4, and a reasonable chance to have 5 power by turn 5 or 6 every time you have a Blade. And 25 Sigils doesn't do that. Sure, the difference here is you always have at least 2 power in your opening hand, but what does it gonna help you if you have an opening hand with 2 power that doesn't find a 3rd power until turn 4 or 5? Then you're simply gonna lose the game most of the time against most decks, unless they have a terrible draw, and you probably win even if your deck has 30 power, because flooding doesn't matter if your opponent is just gonna like lay down and die for you. So flood is not a concern here. Also, you can build your deck in a way that you can compensate for flood. Pyroknight is a great flood protection card. It's a 1-drop that has a lot of synergy with various things in the deck. Warcry, Finest Hour, weapons, while also giving you something to do if you draw that 6th power card that you normally wouldn't need, because at least it's not a 6th power card, it's basically a +4/+4 weapon for your Pyroknight, which is suddenly a lot better than drawing a 6 power sounds. If your 6 power basically transmutes into a +4/+4 weapon if you have a Pyroknight that goes on your Pyroknight is a pretty good deal in my opinion. Same thing goes for monuments. Like this deck basically almost never needs more than 5 power, except the 6th sometimes for Pyroknight, so this is a perfect deck for monuments. Look at that. We have a weapon monument, which also lines up really well with the synergies of the deck. Putting this on a mentioned Pyroknight, for example, also makes sure that the extra stats have overwhelm. Can also put it on a Valkyrie Enforcer or on a quick draw unit to make them more efficient in combat. Sure, 5 power +3/+3 is not super exciting, but given the fact that it is either dead when you are like flooded, or make sure that you actually like hit your land drops, like for example, can easily play this on turn 3 plus a 2-drop because the deck does not have that many 3-drops and is not super reliant on always playing them on turn 3. You don't always want to play your sword or Valkyrie on 3, but you have 12 2-drops, so a lot of the time you can just play a 2-drop and a monument on turn 3 to make sure that you can cast your Hammer of Might on 4 with that last untapped power that you have in your hand, for example. And since we only play red 1-drops, it doesn't matter that these come into play depleted, because on turn 1, if we have no 1-drop, we can just play this. We don't need turn 1 green. We have all our focus on turn 1 undepleted red, so we can just afford to drop some of the Justice Sigils for monuments. And fortunately enough, the green monument is a better one anyway. Like, if you expect more control, I could see potentially cutting the 3rd Emerald Monument for red monument. I think it's Amber Monument or whatever, since the 4/1 charge is generally pretty bad because it trades with like everything and needs a couple of Warcry triggers to be decent, but against control that doesn't have any blockers a lot of the time, a high attack charge unit is actually really good because the health doesn't matter as much and the charge is really powerful there, and the fact that it also doesn't require a unit in play to be impactful is really nice. Currently there's just not enough control, so I rather just play more Emerald Monuments, also because they line up nicer with the mana requirements, with the influence requirements in the deck. So yeah, these easily allow me to run 28 Sigils, which makes me very consistently hit my force power without being punished too much for flooding, because if I draw these extra Sigils, suddenly once I hit my 5th Sigil, I am only the 25 power deck, not the 28 power deck, because these 3 turn into decent weapons. And if I ever hit the 6th, I'm basically, you could say, down to 21 effective power in the deck, because the 6th power, as long as I have a Pyroknight in play, are +4/+4 weapons for my Pyroknight. So I get to run 28 power, while effectively a lot of the time only having 21 actual power in the deck, because I either get to use them as weapons later on or use the 6th one to make my Pyroknights into monsters. So yeah, I think that's a very, very important and critical concept in advanced deck building for aggressive decks. Don't run too few sigils, too few power sources. You might think, sure, you're an aggressive deck, you don't need that much power and flooding feels bad, but unlike Screw, you can build your deck so flooding isn't as bad as it seems, while there's nothing you can do about Screw. If you're stuck on 2 power, you're stuck on 2 power. You can't curve out properly, you can't use your cheaper cards to actually generate tempo, and if you play a 2-drop on turn 3 or 4 while your opponent plays a 3 or 4-drop, you are the one getting tempoed out, and an aggro deck like never recovers from being behind on tempo in almost every case, especially against mid-range decks that have good anti-aggro cards. So it's super critical to curve out and use the tempo that you get from your cards being cheaper than your opponents to do multiple things in one turn, or do the powerful things at the right time, like playing a 2-drop on turn 3 and torching, or finest houring something is what you want to be doing. That's why you run these cheap cards that are cheaper than your opponent that only does one play per turn with his curvy, high-cost mid-range deck, for example. So yeah, I think that sums up everything. One quick note: if you're someone that really likes Inspire and is hellbent on running it, I could see running 27 power. Like, you don't need 28 if you run Inspire. The bare minimum, in my opinion, is 26 if you run Inspire. But I played 26 with Inspire in the very beginning a bit, and it kind of felt awful, especially if you basically have to aggressively Inspire to hit your forced land drop. You're gonna cripple yourself again after all, so basically Inspire becomes kind of like an Emerald Monument. Instead of turning into a 3/3 weapon, it turns into a draw a card, give the next unit +1/+1 type deal, because effectively if you have to cast this on turn 3 to find your 3rd or 4th Sigil, it's kind of like playing a depleted monument on turn 3. So yeah, it's not as good as it looks, and cards that don't really do anything or like have impact on the board are not what you want in an aggressive deck that needs to curve out. So I rather run 27 or 28 Sigils power and no Inspire. If you want to run Inspire, try 26 or 27, probably 27. I mean, the 28th power here is still debatable. I mean, I probably wouldn't fault you too hard for running 27 here without Inspire, especially if maybe these two Crownwatch Cavalries were something cheaper, like a Tinker Apprentice, for example. Then, or like to protect and a Vanquish and stuff like that. If you basically replace these with like 1 to 2 cost cards, I could see going down to 27, for example. But yeah, in terms of math, in Magic, this would be a 23 to 24 land deck in 60 cards. Let's say 24, that's 40%. 40% in this game would mean 30. Because we add 25% cards to the deck, so we have to add 25% land, like power sources, which would mean another 6. Granted, you can reduce that a bit due to needing less power in the deck to get at least a playable hand of a minimum of 2 power sources, but only by a bit, which is why I think 28 is acceptable. That's somewhere between 23 and 24 lands in Magic. But going lower than that is risky. 27 is like the absolute minimum, and I played this deck quite a bunch, and I played it most of the time to get to the ranking that I'm currently at, and the more I played, the more I wanted to add power to this deck. I played 27 for quite a while, and just like a couple days ago went up to 28 just because the ways I lost the most was just sitting there with 2 or 3 power, having cards in hand that could pull me ahead, but I couldn't cast, like a hammer or 3 costing cards. And it's the worst to hold to redraw into these 2 power hands and never find your 3rd power in time and just get pummeled by the opponent. That's just not fun. So yeah, biggest lesson here: make sure you run enough power. I see plenty of decks in this game that run way too few power. You can get away with 25 or 26 power if you play these 2 mana, like 2 power Sigil searchers that are basically slightly better than an actual Sigil if you don't use that power on turn 2 a lot of the time anyway, because you are guaranteed to have at least 2 power in your opening hand, so you're always guaranteed to cast them, unlike in Magic where a 2 cost card is worse than that gets your land is worse than a land, because you might have a 1 land opening hand that you can't keep because your other land source costs 2. If it would cost 1 or would be a land, you could probably keep, for example. So yeah, if you play a slower deck that plays plenty of cards that actually search for sigils, you can get away with a minimum of 25 or 26 sigils, because you have cards that are not sigils but guarantee you sigils and are the equivalent of a sigil with some upside attached that costs you some power. But in a deck like that, you can't have that. So there's not that many decks in this game that should run 25 power and 0 cards in the deck. 0 non-power cards in the deck that get you power. So if you're an aggressive deck that doesn't run stuff like Seek Power or the favors of their colors, make sure to run more than 25 power. I can't stress that enough. It's just that important. Alright, that's my overview of Rakano. One of the top 3 decks on ladder right now. In my opinion, potentially the best deck. I like it a lot better than Burn, I think. And also probably better than Shimmer Pack. Which is why I played it for most of the time. I currently own all 3 decks, tried all 3 of them, and Rakano has impressed me the most and had the best results with him. Shimmer Pack is also pretty good. Burn kind of felt not great to me, and also feel like this deck is the Burn deck is kind of weirdly and poorly built and needs to like evolve somehow to be a really good Stone Scar deck, in my opinion. But this deck is already like very well built, very well designed in its core, and it's just a good deck in its concept and the majority of its execution. And I just fine-tuned some of the aspects that I felt were shortcoming, like Inspire over Pyroknight, too many 5-drops, Righteous Fury, too few sigils basically, and the rest was all there and really great. Alright, that's it with the deck tech. Next I'm gonna jump into a couple of Masters League games to show you the deck in action and explain my thought process and my plays. See you in a moment with the games.